Toy Story 4 versus Toy Story 1. Which movie actually made animation history? Most people would probably say Toy Story 1. But why? After all, Toy Story 4 had a much bigger audience than the original. In fact, it made over $1 billion compared to the original's $375 million. Right now, Toy Story 4 is ranked in the top 10 for all-time computer animated films, while the original sits way down in the 80s. Okay, well, you could say Toy Story was the first computer animated film, but calling anything first gets messy fast. Depending on how you define it, computer animation experiments go back to the 1940s, and the first digital animation shows up in the 1960s. Okay, well, Toy Story was made by Pixar and directed by John Lasseter. That's a major director at a major studio. That has to create film history, right? Wrong! Let's hear what Star Wars creator George Lucas said when he was asked about his place in film history.
I will get maybe mentioned as a very slight footnote in the fact that when we made the transition from the photochemical process to the digital process, they'll say, oh yeah, and there's this guy who was involved in that, but that'll be about all it comes down to in the end.
Wait a second, George Lucas, who created possibly the most iconic film of all time, thinks he'll only be a footnote in film history? What is going on? The difficulty of defining what actually makes history, that's what. It's great food for thought and a fascinating question, and this video will help provide some answers and give you plenty to think about. Hello, my name is Mike, and this is my channel, Minding the Frame. I've taught animation history for years at some of Asia's top arts universities. I'm making a series of animation history videos based on my classes, but you can't really separate the events of animation history from the question of why some animations make history while others don't. I wanted to make a video for people who might feel overwhelmed by all the hype online and wonder what actually matters and what's just a trend that will be forgotten. The issues we'll look at apply to all kinds of history, especially in the arts, but I'll focus on animation, the field I know best. So, what makes history? It's complicated, but also interesting. Not surprisingly, historians have had major disagreements about this. They don't get into fistfights or anything about it, but they do have strong beliefs and they clash with each other. Sometimes they even call each other names. So let's start with the first major beef about what makes history, the great man theory. This is the conventional view of history, that history is all about leaders and what they do. Mostly a record of what kings, queens, military commanders, scientists, and other kinds of leaders do. Despite this name, the great man theory includes women and people who are also evil or destructive but very influential. Despite the issues with sexism and semantics, the name stuck. Anyway, this approach is probably the history you remember from your childhood classes and probably what you hated. A long list of names of dead people, dates, and events from long before you were born that you had to memorize for a test. And I remember hating this type of history when I was in high school. In fact, here's a comic I made when I was a teenager about these boring history videos I had to watch. And now here I am making history videos. Anyway, this view was famously pushed by historian and philosopher Thomas Carlyle in the 1880s. Today, Carlyle's ideas are largely discredited, but even back then, not everybody agreed with him, especially this guy, Herbert Spencer. He was a prominent English intellectual in the 1800s who said the great man theory was primitive, unscientific, and childish. He made some tough arguments against the great man theory, famously saying, before he can remake his society, society must make him. And that a long series of complex influences and outside factors shape history just as much as leaders do. This is the argument that won out in the end. But if history isn't just about individuals, what else shapes the big story? That brings us to the other major way of looking at history from below. History from below emphasizes major outside forces in society. The phrase is actually shorthand for a bunch of different theories, but I don't want this video to get too complicated or academic. Taken to its most extreme, this view dismisses leaders entirely, arguing they are merely side effects of larger forces. Historians in this camp might say that somebody like Adolf Hitler would have inevitably emerged from Germany in the 1930s, given the situation the country was in at the time. More recently, there's been a similar argument about COVID's patient zero, saying that even if you could go back and prevent the first human infection in Wuhan, China, sooner or later, the virus would have infected somebody else and COVID would have spread worldwide anyway. This sense of inevitability seems to be what George Lucas is thinking. That he was merely the first person to take advantage of a larger force shaping the film industry, and if it wasn't him, it would have been somebody else. Which is pretty ironic given how he is undeniably a great man of film history. So, what are the most important outside forces that affect animation history? I'd say they're technology, the media industry, economic and political conditions, and lastly, society and culture. Let's start with the biggest one, technology. Technology can have a huge impact on history, and I'm not talking about Blender 2.8 versus 4.2, but things like the wheel, the printing press, the steam engine, the computer, inventions that set off huge chain reactions across society. Some historians argue that the printing press was the most significant invention of all time because it allowed Bibles to be printed by the thousands instead of written by hand. In addition to spreading literacy beyond a tiny elite, it also shifted who people saw as the ultimate authority, not a king, but God. And if they could read God's words themselves, why would they need men in a church telling them what was said? Needless to say, trouble ensued. Other historians argue that the steam engine was the most important invention in history. It sparked the industrial age, which led to massive social changes. Among many other developments, people left farms to work in cities. Animation began in this period, and I'll cover these changes in another video. For the modern era, the big debate is about AI, the internet, and computer technology. But what all these debates have in common is that whether you're a president, king, queen, emperor, dictator, CEO, a commoner, or just a working animator, the influence of technology will affect you and what you do on many levels. Let's turn to the next outside force shaping animation, the media industry. The media industry is a huge mix of many different groups with different roles and interests. And because animation is just one part of this industry, when the larger media industry changes, so does animation, especially when it comes to these two things, where the audience watches animation and how animation is produced by studios and animators. In the beginning, about 100 years ago, audiences watched animation in public movie theaters. Then, about 40 years later, they added TVs to their living rooms and watched it there. Around 15 years ago, audiences started streaming animation on all kinds of portable screens, smartphones, laptops, tablets, and who knows what else. Video games and other formats showed up along the way too. For animators, production methods changed dramatically over time too. The physical production of animation broadly shifted from drawings on paper to digital methods, along with countless other artistic refinements. For studios, business practices and industry structure also shape animation production. For example, Japanese animation is characterized by a wide range of independent productions, whereas US animation is largely dominated by major Hollywood studios such as Disney and Pixar. And as audiences move around, the industry races to catch up. When television arrived, big studios had to scramble to keep their audiences. Animators suddenly needed to produce shows weekly, which was a big change from having years to work on a film. The new TV stations couldn't just show the same film all week long like a theater could. This created new markets for animated shows and reshaped global distribution of films and other business models. Even today, studios are still trying to figure out streaming platforms like Netflix and YouTube. But the entire media industry is also affected by an even bigger historical force: economic and political conditions. The overall economic and political environment also affects animation. War and depression will obviously limit opportunities for animators, while peace and prosperity create them. One reason America dominated animation history compared to Europe, Russia, and Asia is that US day-to-day life in the 20th century was largely protected from the destruction and chaos of 2 world wars, revolutions, and dictatorships. I'll discuss this a bit more in other videos in the series. Animators can also face censorship or controversy depending on the politics of their time and region. And outside events can change the fate or content of the animation industry as a whole. Nearly all the animation during World War II was propaganda, regardless of which side the country was on. And on a smaller scale, office politics come into play too. Filmmaking is a collaborative process, and the nature of those collaborations affects history and how the films get made. Some studios have a loose collaborative structure, while others follow strong-willed leaders. There's one final big but indirect influence on animation history: society and culture. Art always reflects the people it comes from. Even though animation trades in fantasy, it still reflects the attitudes and culture of the era it was made in. So, when society changes, so will animation. One era's cultural norms can be another's taboo. Take a look at this old cartoon featuring one of the biggest animated stars of its time. The whole story is about killing a woman's career ambitions so she can come back to the house and cook dinner. And not even for a person, but a cat. There's no way a story like this would be accepted today. Now, what is considered socially acceptable is a huge and controversial topic on its own. But whatever these social boundaries are, animators are generally expected to stay within them, even though there are always efforts to push those limits. Also keep in mind that animators are shaped by their culture in subtle ways that aren't controversial. Eastern Europe has a strong tradition of puppet theater, so naturally, animators from that region often favor stop motion. Balancing history from below with the great man theory. So, after looking at all these historical influences, you can probably see why George Lucas downplays his own role in film history. However, even though the great man theory has largely fallen out of favor, we can't dismiss it entirely. The events of the last few years have certainly shown the tension between these two camps. The invasion of Ukraine was shaped by the will of Vladimir Putin. Zelensky's equally strong-willed resistance turned what most people assumed would have been a fast invasion and surrender into a long, drawn-out war. And yet, the last few years have also brought about COVID, which was clearly an outside force that infected nearly everybody, from many of the world's top leaders to the poorest of the poor. Personal power, skills, or social rank were useless against a huge force that will surely go down in the history books. It's probably more accurate to say the great man debate is a constant tension that runs through any attempt to write history. But there are a few other major problems that make history hard to define. This video wouldn't be complete without mentioning them. Let's start with what I brought up at the beginning: the problem with firsts. In some ways, everything is a first. This is the first time you're watching this video. Are we making history? No. But I'm glad you're here. Coming back to Toy Story. Yes, the original Toy Story is historically significant because it was the first 3D computer animated feature film. even though short 3D animations and experiments go back to the 60s. But being the first isn't enough on its own to make history. It's easy to say something is a first, but it's a lot harder to tell whether it will lead to something bigger. Even when something is genuinely new, it often takes years or decades before it actually changes the industry or history at large. The Polar Express was the first major feature-length motion capture animated film. But audiences found the technology creepy, and unlike Toy Story, it got mixed reviews from critics. It did reasonably well, but not a runaway hit like Toy Story was. And it took nearly a decade of incremental improvements for motion capture to even start being accepted by audiences. If Toy Story wasn't a fantastically well-made film, it probably wouldn't have had the same impact on animation history that it did. And even then, it took about 6 years for Hollywood to fully embrace 3D animation. Sometimes history, particularly film history, is determined by the right mix of technology, creativity, audience, and business conditions coming together. Or, as Lenin supposedly said, there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. Historians call this critical juncture, also known as a turning point. Another example of a critical juncture is the use of color in film. When you think of classic films of the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and even 40s, you probably remember them in black and white. But color film had been invented as early as 1902. Unfortunately, the initial techniques needed to put color into films were difficult and expensive. But the 1939 release of The Wizard of Oz changed all this. In one famous scene, Dorothy enters the Wizard of Oz and the film dramatically switches from a flat sepia tone into an explosion of color. This creatively demonstrated the power of color at just the right moment in the film's story and in film history. Oz was popular with both critics and audiences.
Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
From that moment on, the trend shifted to color, and filmmakers had to address a production challenge they no longer could ignore. The Wizard of Oz shows us that what's mainstream today often begins as something obscure, experimental, or even dismissed, and when it starts, people may not even notice or understand the significance of what's beginning. Also clouding the issue is that many firsts are aggressively marketed and hyped, and tech and YouTube channels sensationalize modest changes all the time. If there's an upgrade, it changes everything, and if there's a problem, it's a total disaster. Toy Story 4 was the first film to use AI-created cobwebs. Woohoo! As much as we wish otherwise, you really don't know that a critical juncture has happened until many years later. For example, what we call motion graphics today actually started about 100 years ago when European animators began experimenting with moving abstract design patterns. Personally, I'm old enough to remember when Toy Story first came out. I wasn't an animator yet, but I had a strong feeling that it really would help the outlook for 3D computer graphics. Only after a follow-up film like Bug's Life and then Ants did well, and then Shrek became a massive hit, did it become clear that Toy Story was the start of a new era, not a one-off achievement. That's why, in the larger scheme of history, it doesn't matter how much bigger the Toy Story sequels were than the original. The first film was a critical juncture that had a huge impact on animation, while the sequels were just following in its footsteps. Very well made and successful follow-ups, but not history-making films. So, if you're an animation student frustrated by how your professor ignores your favorite anime show or whatever it is that you like, critical juncture is probably why they emphasize obscure films instead of popular ones. even critically popular ones. From my years of teaching this stuff at universities, I've noticed a huge gap between the popular films and the critical juncture films in my animation history course. I reference hundreds of films during the semester, but outside of a few big Hollywood titles in that group, I'd estimate that more people have seen Toy Story 4 than the total viewership of nearly all the other films in my courses combined together. Of course, what is innovative and has impact isn't always clear-cut or agreed upon. If you're an AI cobweb animator, then Toy Story 4 is a huge history-making film, at least in your eyes. Now, I'm kidding around here, but this brings up another really big issue: the problem of whose story gets told. It's often said that history is written by the victors, which means that history often reflects the views of the socially powerful and the establishment. Sometimes you can't escape the reality that some groups dominated over others, but writing history from this viewpoint brings up an important issue: whose story is being told and who is getting left out. And animation history leaves a lot of people out. And I'm not talking about AI cobweb animators. A long time ago, Disney Studios banned women from animation roles for decades. This is an official letter from Walt Disney Studios flatly stating that women do not do any of the creative work in connection with preparing the cartoons for the screen, as that work is performed entirely by young men. In fact, they were called the color girls because they were only allowed to do simpler work like filling in the colors of finished drawings. To its credit, Disney changed, and women have now directed and produced some of the biggest Hollywood animations at Disney and beyond. However, minorities and people of color remain woefully unrepresented in animation history. I'd go even further and say that most countries, entire continents, and huge swaths of populations across the globe are left out of animation history. The sad reality is that unless your country is a major industrial and media power, it will struggle to form a notable animation industry. The biggest countries or regions that drive animation history would be the USA and Japan at the top, and below them would be Europe, Russia during the Soviet era, and China. And then you have the rest of the world. They're still doing great stuff, but in a one-off sort of way that makes it hard to make a dent in animation history. And that's a shame, because there's fantastic animation being made by individuals and small teams all over the world by just about every type of person. Even North Korea has animators. But listing out every single animator who made a great film or won an award would be overwhelming. And for that reason, huge parts of the world and whole groups of people are left out of animation history. I know some of Hong Kong and Taiwan's top animators, and I've had dinner with them. But they're left out of the history books and even my classes. Sorry, guys. There's one last group of people who are left out of animation history. They don't win awards, their work isn't seen by millions, and some of them don't even consider themselves animators, which brings up the problem of overlooking most animation. Animation and art history typically ignore the great majority of animation that's actually produced. By focusing on the famous parts of the animation world, the Pixars, Miyazakis, and Disneys, history paints a distorted picture of what animation actually is in daily practice. Architecture is similar. It focuses on buildings like this, when most buildings look like this. That last building was designed by Frank Gehry. He recently died and was eulogized as one of the most important architects of our time. But in 2014, a reporter asked if his dynamic buildings were just for showing off. And this is what the high priest of modern architecture had to say. 98% of everything that is built and designed today is pure shit. There's no sense of design, no respect for humanity or for anything else. They're damn buildings and that's it. And Gary's numbers are also true for animation. Think of every possible animation out there. PowerPoint animations, blinking UI elements, cheap explainer videos, YouTube brain rot, ads, spinning logos, and so on. These are animation too. Huge amounts of animation are created every day by people with little to no professional experience who have little regard for aesthetics or storytelling. They simply want to add some movement to their projects using automated tools. And the sheer volume of these types of animations far outnumbers every film, TV show, and festival screening ever made. Given all this, can you say history is really accurate if it ignores 98% of what's going on? It helps to keep in mind that animation's full story isn't just about the masterpieces, but also the everyday work that people see far more often. Now, granted, little pieces of junky animation should be forgotten by history. But collectively speaking, the massive amount of all these everyday animations is a reality of history too. I hope this video has helped you sort out hype from history and given you some new insights into why history is difficult to define. And mostly, I hope you enjoyed watching it. If you want to keep exploring animation history with me, you can find the rest of the series in the playlist linked below. You can start in two ways. If you want to jump right into the first period of animation history, go here. And if you want to find out more about this series, go here. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.